long before the great pyramids of Tikal pierced the jungle canopy, long before kings carved their names in stone, the story of the Maya begins not with empire, but with corn. Around 7000 BC, in the highlands of Mexico and Guatemala, nomadic hunters made a discovery that would reshape the world. Wild teosinte, a scraggly grass with tiny seeds, began its slow transformation into maize through careful selection and cultivation. This wasn't just agriculture. It was the foundation of civilization itself. The archaic peoples of Mesoamerica lived in small bands, following seasonal patterns of hunting and gathering. They harvested wild avocados, collected cacao pods, and trapped deer in the forests. But as maize yields improved generation by generation, something revolutionary happened. People could stay in one place. By 2000 BC, the first permanent villages appeared across the region. These weren't the grand cities we associate with later civilization, but modest clusters of thatched houses surrounding cleared fields. The people who built them spoke early forms of what would become a linguistic family of over 30 distinct tongues, from Yucatec in the north to Quechua in the southern highlands. These early settlers weren't alone in their innovations. To the west, the Olmec civilization was reaching its peak, creating colossal stone heads and establishing trade networks that stretched across Mesoamerica. The emerging communities encountered Olmec merchants carrying jade, obsidian, and revolutionary ideas about kingship, ritual, and the cosmos. From the Olmec, these early peoples borrowed their first writing symbols, their concept of divine rulers, and their practice of erecting stone monuments to commemorate important events. They adopted the Olmec calendar system and their method of laying out ceremonial centers according to cosmic principles. But rather than simply copying, they adapted, refined, and ultimately surpassed their teachers. By 1000 BC, Proto-Maya sites like Nakbe were emerging in the Petén rainforests of northern Guatemala. These weren't villages anymore, but genuine urban centers with monumental architecture. Nakbe's massive platforms, some reaching 45 feet in height, required thousands of workers and sophisticated planning. Here, for the first time, we see this civilization mastering the jungle, rather than simply surviving in it. The transition from village to city brought new challenges. How do you organize thousands of people? How do you manage food distribution, coordinate construction projects, and maintain social order? The emerging societies developed solutions that would define their civilization for millennia. Hereditary leadership, ritual calendars, and the written word. El Mirador, rising even grander than Nakbe around 600 BC, shows us the full flowering of these early innovations. Its Ladanta complex, covering 18 acres and rising 230 feet above the forest floor, remains one of the largest pyramids ever built in the Americas. This wasn't just impressive architecture. It was a statement of power, a connection to the gods, and a demonstration that this ancient people had truly arrived as a major civilization. These early cities didn't emerge in isolation. Trade routes crisscrossed the region, carrying not just goods, but ideas. Obsidian from highland Guatemala traveled to lowland cities, while jade from the Motagua Valley reached sites hundreds of miles away. Cacao beans, the food of the gods, became both sustenance and currency, establishing patterns of exchange that would persist until the Spanish conquest. The inhabitants also began developing their sophisticated understanding of time and astronomy during this period. Early stelae, carved stone monuments, record dates using a system that tracked multiple interlocking cycles. This wasn't just record keeping. It was a way of understanding humanity's place in the cosmic order. These ancient astronomers believed that time moved in cycles, that the past could inform the future, and that certain days were more auspicious than others for important activities. Perhaps most importantly, these early peoples developed innovative approaches to agriculture that allowed them to thrive in challenging environments. In the wetlands, they created raised fields that provided drainage and fertile soil. In the forests, they practiced a sophisticated form of forest management, preserving useful trees while clearing land for crops. They learned to capture and store rainwater, creating the infrastructure that would support much larger populations in the centuries to come. The linguistic diversity that emerged during this period reflects their remarkable adaptation to varied environments. Highland languages developed vocabulary for mountain agriculture and volcanic soils, while lowland tongues created rich terminology for jungle ecology and water management. This linguistic diversity wasn't a sign of division. It was evidence of their remarkable ability to adapt culture to different landscapes while maintaining core traditions and beliefs. By 100 BC, however, many of these early centers faced crisis. El Mirador, once the greatest city in Mesoamerica, was largely abandoned. The causes remain debated, perhaps drought, perhaps social upheaval, perhaps the breakdown of trade networks. Whatever the reason, the first chapter of urban civilization came to an abrupt end. Yet this wasn't truly an ending. The knowledge, traditions, and innovations of these early cities didn't disappear. They dispersed, evolved, and eventually re-emerged in new forms. The collapse of El Mirador and its contemporaries created space for new centers to rise, setting the stage for the greatest period in the region's history. The seeds planted during these formative centuries, divine kingship, monumental architecture, sophisticated agriculture, complex writing systems, and precise astronomical observation, would bloom spectacularly in the classic period. The foundation had been established. Now it was time to build the pyramid. The jungle fell silent after El Mirador's abandonment, but not for long. Within generations, new centers began rising from the forest floor, each more ambitious than the last. The collapse of the early giants had scattered their knowledge like seeds on the wind, and where those seeds landed, extraordinary things began to grow. Around 300 BC, construction resumed at sites across the lowlands with renewed vigor. At Caminaljuyu, nestled in the volcanic highlands of Guatemala, massive earthen mounds rose above the valley floor. Unlike their predecessors who worked primarily in stone, the builders here shaped monuments from clay and volcanic ash, creating platforms that would endure for millennia. The scale of these new projects was staggering. Single platforms required moving hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of earth, all carried in baskets by human hands. But this wasn't just manual labor. It was a coordinated effort that demanded sophisticated planning, hierarchy, and leadership. Someone had to organize the workers, coordinate the schedules, and envision the final product. That someone was becoming recognizable as a new kind of leader, the divine king. These emerging rulers claimed something unprecedented: direct communication with the gods. They weren't merely chiefs or war leaders, but sacred intermediaries who could channel divine will into earthly action. Stone monuments began appearing, with carved figures wearing elaborate headdresses, their bodies covered in supernatural symbols that proclaimed their cosmic authority. The invention of these royal portraits marked a revolution in human expression. For the first time, individual rulers were being immortalized in stone, their names and deeds recorded for eternity. Early hieroglyphic texts, still crude compared to what would come later, began appearing on stelae and building facades. These weren't just decorative, they were historical documents, proclaiming victories, recording astronomical events, and establishing legitimacy through divine genealogy. Writing systems evolved rapidly during this period, borrowing heavily from Olmec traditions, but developing uniquely regional characteristics. The scribes who carved these early texts were creating more than communication. They were crafting a new relationship between past, present, and future. Royal history could now be preserved, consulted, and manipulated to serve political purposes. Religious architecture became increasingly sophisticated as well. Ceremonial complexes now featured multiple pyramids arranged around central plazas, creating spaces designed for mass gatherings and elaborate rituals. The famous E-group arrangements, 3 structures aligned to track the sun's movement throughout the year, appeared at sites across the region, demonstrating a growing mastery of astronomical observation. These architectural innovations weren't just aesthetic choices. They reflected fundamental changes in how society organized itself. The massive labor investments required for monumental construction demanded surplus food production, specialized craftsmen, and complex administrative systems. Villages were transforming into genuine urban centers with distinct social classes, occupational specialization, and centralized authority. Trade networks expanded dramatically during this period, connecting highlands and lowlands in unprecedented ways. Obsidian from volcanic peaks traveled hundreds of miles to lowland sites, while jade from the Motagua Valley reached highland centers. Coastal salt became a valuable commodity throughout the interior, while cacao beans from lowland groves reached mountain settlements. These weren't casual exchanges. They were systematic commercial relationships that bound diverse regions into a single economic system. The ball court emerged as a central feature of urban planning during this era. These distinctive eye-shaped playing fields weren't just athletic venues. They were sacred spaces where cosmic dramas played out through ritual competition. The game itself represented the eternal struggle between life and death, order and chaos, with players reenacting mythological battles that determined the fate of the world. Regional variations became more pronounced as different areas developed distinctive architectural styles and cultural practices. Highland centers like Kaminal-Juyu favored earthen construction and volcanic stone, while lowland sites continued working primarily in limestone. Coastal settlements developed unique adaptations for maritime environments, while interior sites focused on forest management and water control. The emergence of craft specialization created new social categories beyond the traditional farmer-ruler divide. Skilled artisans working in jade, obsidian, ceramics, and textiles formed distinct occupational groups with their own neighborhoods, workshops, and trade connections. These craftsmen weren't just producing utilitarian objects. They were creating the luxury goods that marked elite status and facilitated long-distance exchange. Linguistic diversity continued expanding as different regions developed specialized vocabulary for their particular environments and activities. Highland languages incorporated terms for volcanic phenomena and mountain agriculture, while lowland tongues created extensive terminology for forest ecology and water management. This linguistic richness reflected the increasingly complex ways people were interacting with their diverse landscapes. Agricultural innovations accelerated as growing populations demanded more reliable food production. Raised field systems expanded in wetland areas, providing both drainage and fertility enhancement. Terracing appeared in highland zones, allowing cultivation on steep slopes while preventing erosion. Forest management became increasingly sophisticated, with farmers maintaining complex polycultures that mimicked natural ecosystems while producing human food. Water management emerged as a crucial technology during this period. Sites like Tikal began constructing elaborate systems of reservoirs, canals, and dams that could capture and store rainwater during the wet season for use during dry months. These hydraulic works required coordinated labor and technical expertise that matched the complexity of monumental architecture. The development of formal calendrical systems reached new levels of precision during this era. Multiple interlocking cycles, solar, lunar, and Venus-based, were integrated into comprehensive chronological frameworks that could track time across vast spans. These weren't just practical tools for scheduling agricultural activities. They were cosmological instruments that revealed the underlying patterns governing existence itself. Political systems grew more complex as successful centers expanded their influence over surrounding areas. Smaller sites began acknowledging the authority of larger ones, creating the first hints of the hierarchical relationships that would characterize later periods. These weren't necessarily conquest relationships. They often involved voluntary alliances based on trade, marriage, and shared ritual obligations. Yet even as this remarkable flowering reached its peak around 100 AD, signs of trouble began appearing. Monument construction slowed at many sites, and some centers showed evidence of conflict or rapid abandonment. The causes remain debated: extended drought, internal political upheaval, or perhaps the breakdown of trade networks that had become essential to urban life. The collapse, when it came, was swift and dramatic. Major centers across the region fell silent within a few generations, their plazas empty, their workshops abandoned. But unlike the earlier collapse of El Mirador, this crisis didn't end the story. It transformed it. The innovations of the pre-classic period had created a cultural foundation, too strong to disappear entirely. In the ruins of the old centers, new ideas were taking root. The divine kingship, monumental architecture, sophisticated writing, and cosmic calendars developed during this remarkable period would soon re-emerge in even more spectacular forms. The stage was set for the greatest chapter in the story of ancient America. The middle of the 3rd century marked no particular ceremony, no grand proclamation, no cosmic event visible to the naked eye. Yet it represents one of history's most remarkable transformations, the moment when scattered city-states across Mesoamerica exploded into the most sophisticated civilization the Americas had ever known. From the Petén rainforests to the volcanic highlands, ambitious rulers began carving their names into eternity. Stone monuments rose from jungle floors, recording dates with mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. This wasn't just the rise of new cities. It was the birth of a cosmic worldview that would reshape human understanding of time, space, and divine authority. Tikal emerged as the first great power of this new age. Rising from the forest like a man-made mountain range, its towering pyramids proclaimed the arrival of something unprecedented. Temple 4, completed during the 8th century, stretched 230 feet above the canopy, taller than a 20-story building and visible for miles across the jungle. But Tikal's true innovation wasn't architectural, it was political. Here, divine kingship reached its full flowering, with rulers claiming direct descent from gods and the power to communicate with supernatural forces. The kings of Tikal weren't mere mortals wearing fancy headdresses. They were living conduits between earthly and celestial realms, their every action imbued with cosmic significance. When Jasar Chan Kawil, I dedicated a new temple near the end of the 7th century, he wasn't just celebrating a construction project. He was recreating the moment when the gods first raised the sky from primordial waters. Royal ceremonies became theatrical reenactments of creation myths, with kings playing the roles of creator deities before audiences of thousands. Yet Tikal's dominance faced immediate challenges. 200 miles to the north, Calakmul was building its own empire with equal ambition and superior cunning. The rulers of this northern powerhouse understood something crucial. In a world of competing city-states, victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the most connected. Through marriages, alliances, and strategic warfare, Calakmul wove a web of influence that eventually stretched across half the region. The rivalry between these superpowers defined classic period politics for 3 centuries. But this wasn't simple territorial expansion. It was ideological warfare fought with astronomical precision. Battles were timed to Venus cycles, with rulers claiming celestial endorsement for their campaigns. Victory monuments recorded not just military triumphs, but cosmic alignments that proved divine favor. When armies marched, they carried more than weapons. They carried the authority of the stars themselves. Copan, nestled in the Honduran highlands, chose a different path to greatness. Rather than military conquest, its rulers pursued intellectual supremacy. The famous hieroglyphic stairway, completed during the mid-8th century, contains over 2,500 individual glyphs, the longest known text from ancient America. This wasn't just decoration. It was a comprehensive history of the dynasty, tracing royal lineage back through 15 generations to the city's founding father, Yax Kukmo. The scribes who created these texts were developing writing into an art form of unprecedented sophistication. Hieroglyphic inscriptions could record not just names and dates, but complex historical narratives, religious concepts, and even political propaganda. The same event might be described differently on monuments in allied versus enemy cities, showing that ancient rulers understood the power of controlling historical narrative. Palenque, rising from the jungle hills of Chiapas, produced perhaps the most remarkable ruler of the entire classic period. Kinich Janab Pakal the Great reigned for 68 years, longer than any European monarch of his era. His tomb, discovered deep within the Temple of Inscriptions, revealed burial goods of stunning sophistication. Jade masks, intricate ceramics, and inscriptions claiming he would be reborn as a god. But Pakal's greatest innovation was transforming royal propaganda into cosmic theatre. His monuments claimed he had been born on the same day as gods, that his reign was prophesied in ancient times, and that his death would mark the beginning of a new world age. When he finally died during the late 7th century, at age 80, his successors continued the performance, commissioning texts that described his posthumous activities in the underworld and his eventual resurrection as a celestial deity. These royal courts weren't just political centers. They were economic powerhouses that transformed regional trade networks. Caracol, rising in what is now Belize, controlled crucial trade routes connecting highland Guatemala with Caribbean coastal settlements. Its rulers grew wealthy, taxing obsidian caravans and cacao shipments, using this wealth to commission massive construction projects that rivaled anything built by their more famous neighbors. The ballgame reached its peak significance during this period, evolving from simple sport into elaborate cosmic drama. Courts weren't just playing fields. They were sacred spaces representing the underworld itself. Players reenacted mythological battles between gods and demons, with games sometimes ending in human sacrifice. The rubber ball represented the sun's daily journey through the heavens, and successful play ensured continued cosmic order. Royal women wielded unprecedented power during the classic period. Lady Six Sky of Wat Cabnal ruled in her own right for over 60 years, commissioning monuments that depicted her performing traditionally male ceremonies like scattering incense and capturing enemies. At Palenque, Lady Sak Kook served as regent for her young son, ensuring dynastic continuity during a crucial political transition. These weren't token female rulers. They were powerful political actors who shaped regional politics for generations. Agricultural innovation reached new heights, as growing populations demanded reliable food production. Engineers developed sophisticated raised field systems in wetland areas, creating networks of canals that provided both transportation and irrigation. Highland settlements carved elaborate terraces into mountainsides, preventing erosion while expanding cultivatable land. Forest management became increasingly complex, with farmers maintaining polycultures that produced food, medicine, and construction materials simultaneously. Water management systems of stunning complexity appeared at major centers. Tikal's engineers constructed a network of reservoirs, dams, and canals that could store over 900,000 gallons of water, enough to sustain the city through extended dry seasons. These weren't just practical solutions. They were technological marvels that required precise mathematical calculations and coordinated labor forces numbering in the thousands. The astronomical sophistication of classic period science rivals anything achieved in the ancient world. At Zoltan, recently discovered murals show scribes calculating Venus cycles, lunar eclipses, and Mars retrograde periods with remarkable precision. They could predict eclipses centuries in advance and track planetary movements with accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. Mathematics flourished alongside astronomy, with scribes developing conceptual tools that surpassed their contemporaries worldwide. The invention of zero as a mathematical concept occurred independently here, centuries before it appeared in Indian mathematics. Positional notation allowed calculations involving millions, while complex calendrical systems tracked multiple interlocking cycles simultaneously. Art reached unprecedented levels of sophistication during this golden age. Palace walls featured murals depicting court life with photographic realism, nobles wearing elaborate costumes, servants preparing food, musicians performing for royal audiences. Ceramic vessels became narrative canvases, their painted surfaces telling complex mythological stories that required extensive cultural knowledge to fully understand. Jade working achieved extraordinary refinement, with craftsmen creating objects of breathtaking beauty and symbolic complexity. Royal burial masks incorporated hundreds of individually carved pieces, each positioned according to cosmic principles. The famous jade mask of Tikal the Great required over 340 separate pieces, assembled to represent the king's transformation into the maize god after death. Trade networks during this period spanned thousands of miles, connecting regions with dramatically different resources and cultural traditions. Obsidian from highland volcanoes reached coastal settlements, while marine shells from Pacific and Caribbean shores appeared in highland burials. Cacao beans served as standardized currency, allowing complex economic transactions across vast distances. Specialized craft production created new social categories beyond the traditional farmer elite divide. Neighborhoods of skilled artisans produced luxury goods for regional and long-distance trade. These weren't just individual craftsmen. They were organized workshops with master artisans, apprentices, and complex production hierarchies. Archaeological evidence shows standardized production techniques and quality control measures that rival modern manufacturing systems. Religious practice became increasingly elaborate as rulers competed to demonstrate their cosmic connections. Bloodletting ceremonies reached new levels of intensity, with royals piercing tongues, earlobes, and genitals to offer their life force to supernatural powers. Human sacrifice, while never as common as later stereotypes suggest, became more ritualized and symbolically complex. The development of formal writing systems revolutionized record-keeping and historical consciousness. Scribes could now record not just contemporary events, but genealogies stretching back centuries and prophecies extending far into the future. This created a new relationship with time itself. Past, present, and future became interconnected segments of a cosmic cycle that could be studied, understood, and influenced through proper ritual action. Yet even at the height of this remarkable flowering, seeds of future troubles were being planted. Monuments from the late classic period show increasing emphasis on warfare and military themes. Population growth was straining agricultural systems, while climate data suggests the region was entering a period of increased drought frequency. The very success of classic civilization was creating conditions that would eventually challenge its continued existence. As the 8th century progressed, the greatest cities in human history were approaching their zenith. Royal courts commanded unprecedented wealth and power. Monumental architecture reached scales that wouldn't be equaled for centuries, and intellectual achievements rivaled the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Yet within a century, many of these magnificent centers would fall silent, their plazas empty, their royal dynasties extinct. The classic period represents humanity at its most ambitious, a time when kings claimed godhood, when cities rivaled mountains, and when human understanding of mathematics and astronomy reached heights that wouldn't be surpassed for a millennium. It was civilization's most spectacular flowering, and its achievements would echo through time long after its collapse. War came to the ancient world, not with the clashing of bronze or the thunder of horses, but with the careful calculation of celestial mechanics. In the greatest rivalry Mesoamerica had ever witnessed, kings timed their battles to the movements of Venus, claiming that victory belonged not to the strongest army, but to those who fought when the gods commanded. The conflict between the southern powerhouse and its northern rival would define 3 centuries of statecraft, transforming scattered city-states into vast networks of allies and vassals. This wasn't merely territorial expansion. It was a struggle for cosmic legitimacy fought across a stage stretching from the Caribbean coast to the Pacific highlands. The prize wasn't just land or tribute, but the right to claim divine authority over the greatest civilization the Americas had ever known. The Northern Kingdom struck first, understanding that in a world of divine kingship, perception mattered as much as military strength. Through careful diplomacy and strategic marriages, this ambitious power began weaving a web of alliances that would eventually encompass dozens of lesser centers. Royal daughters were sent as brides to distant courts, carrying with them not just dowries, but intelligence networks that would prove crucial in future campaigns. Tribute obligations were restructured to create economic dependencies, while religious ceremonies were synchronized to demonstrate unified cosmic purpose. When northern armies finally marched south during the 6th century, they came not as conquerors, but as liberators, claiming to free oppressed cities from southern tyranny. This sophisticated propaganda campaign painted the southern power as a corrupt dynasty that had lost divine favor, while presenting the northern kingdom as the righteous instrument of cosmic justice. Local grievances were carefully exploited, with northern agents promising relief from excessive tribute demands and greater autonomy for regional elites. The propaganda campaigns proved as sophisticated as the military operations. Victory stelae, erected after successful battles, didn't simply record conquests. They described cosmic events where earthly rulers participated in celestial dramas. When the morning star appeared in the sky, it signaled the time for combat. When eclipses darkened the heavens, they validated the divine authority of victorious kings. Stellar observation became statecraft, and calendars became weapons of legitimacy. These propaganda efforts required extensive coordination across multiple cities and regions. Scribes worked to ensure that monuments in allied cities told consistent stories about recent victories, while court artists developed standardized iconography that could be understood across linguistic boundaries. The same symbolic language that appeared on northern stelae was reproduced in vassal cities hundreds of miles away, creating a unified visual narrative of cosmic authority that reinforced the Northern Empire's claims to universal dominion. The jungle capital's first great defeat came as a shock that reverberated across the ancient world. During the middle of the 6th century, northern forces captured the city in a campaign that contemporaries described as a star war, a conflict timed to planetary cycles and endorsed by supernatural powers. The humiliation was so complete that the southern monuments fell silent for over a century, a period archaeologists call the hiatus. The conquest itself was a masterpiece of coordinated strategy. Northern forces didn't simply besiege the southern capital. They systematically dismantled its network of allies first. Secondary centers were captured or converted through combinations of military pressure and diplomatic incentives. Trade routes were severed, cutting off the flow of tribute and luxury goods that sustained the southern court. By the time northern armies reached the main city, its rulers found themselves isolated, their traditional sources of support either destroyed or turned against them. The aftermath of this victory demonstrated the Northern Kingdom's sophisticated understanding of imperial administration. Rather than destroying the conquered city, northern rulers installed a puppet dynasty while maintaining the existing administrative structure. Local elites who submitted willingly were confirmed in their positions, while those who resisted were replaced with northern appointees. This policy of selective integration helped consolidate control while minimizing ongoing resistance. Yet this defeat planted the seeds of future revenge. The exiled royal family spent generations plotting their return, building new alliances and waiting for the right celestial moment to reclaim their throne. When that moment finally arrived during the late 7th century, their vengeance would reshape the diplomatic landscape of Mesoamerica forever. The concept of Star Wars reveals the sophisticated celestial knowledge underlying ancient statecraft. The morning star, with its predictable cycle of appearances and disappearances, became the heavenly clock that governed combat. Rulers who could accurately predict these cycles gained tremendous advantage, appearing to control cosmic forces that determined victory and defeat. These calculations required mathematical precision that rivaled anything achieved in the ancient world. Court astronomers tracked not just the bright planet, but Mars' retrograde periods, lunar eclipses, and complex calendrical cycles. Combat became a science where military strategy merged with celestial mechanics, creating a new form of governance that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. Strategic marriages wove the competing networks together in increasingly complex ways. Royal women weren't just diplomatic tokens. They were active agents who maintained communication between their birth cities and adopted homes. When Princess Ninth Skull of the Southern Power married into the royal house of Yaxmal, she didn't abandon her loyalty to her father's kingdom. Instead, she became a crucial intelligence asset, providing information about northern plans while influencing her new city's decisions. These matrimonial alliances created intricate webs of obligation and opportunity that often outlasted the military campaigns that initially forged them. Children of such unions found themselves with legitimate claims to multiple thrones, creating succession crises that could destabilize entire regions. Royal women often served as regents for young sons, wielding significant power during transitional periods. The most successful female rulers learned to manipulate these complex kinship networks, playing different factions against each other while building their own independent power bases. The diplomatic protocols surrounding these marriages revealed the sophisticated court culture that had evolved during the classic period. Wedding ceremonies might last for weeks, with elaborate gift exchanges that redistributed wealth across vast distances. Marriage contracts specified not just dynastic arrangements, but detailed agreements about trade privileges, military obligations, and religious ceremonies. The negotiation process itself could take years, with representatives traveling back and forth between courts to hammer out acceptable terms. The system of vassal states created unprecedented diplomatic complexity. Lesser cities found themselves caught between competing superpowers, forced to choose sides in conflicts that could determine their survival. Dos Pilas, strategically located between the two giants, attempted to play both sides, accepting tribute obligations to the Northern Empire while maintaining trade relationships with the Southern Kingdom. This dangerous game would eventually lead to the city's spectacular destruction. The tributary system that emerged from these conflicts was far more sophisticated than simple taxation. Vassal cities were expected to provide not just material goods, but specialized services. Military units for campaigns, skilled craftsmen for royal projects, scribes for administrative tasks. In return, they received protection, access to trade networks, and participation in the prestigious ceremonial cycles that legitimized elite status. The most successful vassal rulers learned to make themselves indispensable to their overlords, developing expertise in areas like stellar observation, luxury craft production, or military engineering that guaranteed their continued autonomy. Regional power dynamics shifted constantly as lesser centers sought to improve their positions within these hierarchical networks. Cities that began as tribute-paying vassals might gradually accumulate enough wealth and influence to challenge their overlords directly. Conversely, former regional powers could find themselves reduced to vassal status after military defeats or succession crises. This constant fluidity created opportunities for ambitious rulers, but also generated endemic instability that would eventually contribute to the system's collapse. Alliance networks shifted constantly as rulers died, successions were disputed, and military fortunes changed. A city that served as the northern power's faithful ally, one generation, might become the southern capital's vassal the next, depending on marriage connections, military outcomes, or simple opportunism. These realignments created a dynamic system where no alliance was permanent, and every relationship was constantly renegotiated. The resurrection of southern power began with careful preparation that spanned decades. Chichén Itzá didn't simply gather armies. He rebuilt the city's stellar observation capabilities, commissioned new monuments to demonstrate divine favor, and carefully cultivated alliances with the Northern Kingdom's disaffected vassals. When he finally struck back near the end of the 7th century, his victory was as much intellectual as military. The battle that restored southern dominance was timed to a rare conjunction that occurred only once every several centuries. Northern forces, caught unprepared for an attack during what they considered an inauspicious period, suffered a devastating defeat. Their king was captured and apparently sacrificed in the jungle capital's central plaza, ending the Northern Empire's century of regional hegemony. Victory monuments erected after this triumph reveal the sophisticated propaganda techniques both sides employed. Southern scribes described the conflict in cosmic terms, claiming their king had defeated not just human enemies, but supernatural forces of chaos. Captured weapons and regalia were displayed as evidence that the gods themselves had switched sides, abandoning the northern power to support the southern cause. The consequences of this resurgence cascaded throughout the region. Cities that had served the Northern Empire for generations suddenly found themselves scrambling to demonstrate loyalty to the newly dominant power. Tribute obligations reversed overnight, trade routes shifted, and royal marriages were hastily renegotiated to accommodate the new reality. Yet the very success of these superpower conflicts created conditions for widespread instability. The Patex Batun region, caught between shifting alliance networks, descended into chaos as competing dynasties fought for control. Dos Pilas, once a powerful regional center, was violently destroyed during the 8th century, its monuments smashed and its population scattered. The fall of Dos Pilas illustrates how the superpower rivalry destabilized smaller centers throughout the region. As the great powers competed for influence, they encouraged their vassals to attack each other, creating a cascade of conflicts that eventually consumed entire regions. The very system that had created unprecedented prosperity was now generating the conditions for its own destruction. Royal courts became increasingly militarized as combat intensified throughout the 8th century. Palaces that had once featured elaborate reception halls and scribal schools were rebuilt with defensive walls and guard towers. Art from this period shows rulers dressed for battle rather than ceremony, reflecting the new reality of constant military threat. Population movements accelerated as people fled war-torn regions for more secure territories. Archaeological evidence shows the rapid abandonment of sites in contested frontier zones, while fortified hilltop settlements proliferated in previously peaceful areas. The sophisticated urban civilization of the Classic period was fragmenting into defensive enclaves, separated by increasingly dangerous borderlands. The breakdown of long-distance trade networks severely impacted the economic foundations of urban civilization. Obsidian from highland Guatemala became scarce in lowland sites, while coastal products rarely reached interior markets. The commercial relationships that had sustained Classic period prosperity were severed by constant fighting and instability. Elite infighting intensified as traditional sources of legitimacy, military victory, celestial knowledge, divine genealogy, became contested and unreliable. Rulers who could no longer guarantee prosperity or security faced challenges from ambitious relatives, disaffected nobles, and emerging military leaders who promised more effective protection. The sophistication of defensive architecture reveals how thoroughly combat had transformed urban planning. Cities like Aguateca were rebuilt as fortresses with massive walls, restricted access points, and defensive positions commanding strategic approaches. These weren't temporary military installations, they were permanent transformations that reflected the new reality of endemic conflict. As the 8th century drew to a close, the very success of the Star Wars was generating the conditions for civilizational collapse. The system that had created the greatest cities in ancient America was now consuming itself in an escalating cycle of violence that would soon bring the entire classic world crashing down. The legacy of these cosmic conflicts extended far beyond military history. The stellar knowledge developed for combat continued influencing decisions long after the great powers fell. The propaganda techniques pioneered during these celestial campaigns established patterns of royal legitimacy that would persist through subsequent periods. Most importantly, the alliance networks and relationships forged during these conflicts created the foundation for the civilizations that would eventually emerge from the Classic collapse. When future historians looked back on this period, they would see not just the end of an era, but the transformation of an entire worldview. These astronomical campaigns represented the ultimate evolution of divine kingship and its ultimate failure. In claiming to control cosmic forces, rulers had created a system too complex and volatile to sustain. The heavenly bodies that had once guided them to victory would soon witness their spectacular fall. The term Star War itself reveals how completely astronomical thinking had penetrated military strategy. These weren't merely battles fought under auspicious skies. They were cosmic events where earthly rulers participated in celestial dramas. When kings declared Star Wars, they were claiming that their conflicts mirrored supernatural battles between gods and demons, with planetary movements serving as both battlefield and divine commentary. Victory in such campaigns didn't just demonstrate military superiority. It proved that the cosmos itself endorsed the winner's claim to divine authority. The first signs appeared not in monuments or royal proclamations, but in the soil itself. Deep beneath the plazas of great centers, archaeological layers tell a story of gradual environmental degradation that would ultimately bring down the most sophisticated society the Americas had ever known. What began as minor agricultural adjustments would cascade into a catastrophic decline that left jungle settlements silent and royal dynasties extinct. Forest clearance had accelerated dramatically during the late 8th century as growing populations demanded more farmland. Vast areas around major centers were stripped of their natural vegetation, disrupting water cycles and exposing fragile tropical soils to erosion. The very success of intensive agriculture was undermining the environmental foundations that sustained urban society. Soil samples from this period show dramatically increased sedimentation in lakes and rivers, evidence of widespread ecological destruction. The deforestation created a vicious cycle that amplified every environmental stress. Without forest cover to retain moisture, dry seasons became more severe, and wet seasons brought devastating floods. The complex water management systems that cities had developed over centuries began failing as watersheds degraded and seasonal patterns became increasingly unpredictable. Reservoirs that had reliably stored water for months now dried up within weeks, while formerly manageable floods destroyed crops and infrastructure. Climate data reveals that the region was simultaneously experiencing a period of increased drought frequency. Tree ring studies from across Mesoamerica show that the 8th and 9th centuries brought some of the most severe dry periods in over a millennium. What might have been manageable environmental challenges in earlier times became existential threats to cities that had already stressed their ecological support systems beyond sustainable limits. The agricultural crisis struck different regions with varying intensity, creating complex patterns of population movement and resource competition. Highland areas with reliable water sources initially fared better than lowland cities, dependent on sophisticated irrigation systems. Coastal settlements with access to marine resources maintained stability longer than inland centers, relying purely on agricultural surpluses. These disparities created new sources of conflict as desperate populations migrated toward more stable regions. Monument construction, the most visible symbol of royal power and divine authority, began declining noticeably during the late 8th century. The last dated monuments at many major centers cluster around this period, suggesting that rulers could no longer command the resources necessary for large-scale construction projects. At Copan, the famous hieroglyphic stairway was left unfinished, its final inscriptions abruptly terminating mid-sentence. At Palenque, construction ceased entirely after centuries of continuous building activity. The cessation of monument erection represented more than just economic constraints. It marked the breakdown of the ideological systems that legitimized royal authority. Kings who could no longer commission impressive public works found their claims to divine favor increasingly questioned. The astronomical calculations and calendrical predictions that had once demonstrated cosmic authority became irrelevant when rulers could no longer organize the ceremonies and construction projects that made such knowledge politically meaningful. Elite infighting intensified as traditional sources of legitimacy became unreliable. Archaeological evidence from palace complexes shows increasing militarization during this period, with defensive walls and guard towers added to previously open ceremonial spaces. Royal courts that had once focused on artistic patronage and intellectual pursuits were transformed into armed camps, where competing factions struggled for control of dwindling resources. The breakdown of long-distance trade networks severed the economic relationships that had sustained classic period prosperity. Obsidian from highland Guatemala virtually disappeared from lowland archaeological sites during the 9th century, while coastal products became increasingly rare in interior settlements. The commercial networks that had once redistributed resources across vast distances fragmented into isolated regional systems that could no longer support large urban populations. Population decline accelerated as agricultural failures and resource shortages made urban life increasingly untenable. Demographic studies suggest that some cities lost up to 90% of their inhabitants within a few generations. The exodus wasn't gradual, it was a catastrophic collapse that left vast urban centers almost completely abandoned within decades. House foundations show evidence of hasty abandonment, with valuable goods left behind as families fled to seek survival elsewhere. The collapse manifested differently across various regions, creating a complex mosaic of survival and abandonment. The southern lowlands, where the greatest classic cities had flourished, experienced the most dramatic population losses. Centers like Copan, Palenque, and dozens of smaller sites were virtually abandoned by the 10th century. However, northern regions showed remarkable resilience, with cities like Chichén Itzá actually expanding during this period as they absorbed refugees from collapsing southern centers. Regional variations in collapse timing and severity reflect the complex interplay of environmental, social, and economic factors that drove the crisis. Cities with diversified resource bases and flexible agricultural systems survived longer than those dependent on intensive maize production. Centers that maintained access to trade routes could import essential goods to offset local shortages. Political flexibility also mattered. Cities with more adaptable governance structures proved better able to respond to changing circumstances than those locked into rigid hierarchical systems. The role of endemic conflict in accelerating collapse cannot be understated. As resources became scarcer, competition between cities intensified dramatically. Archaeological evidence shows increased fortification at many sites during the late Classic period, with defensive walls, moats, and strategic positioning becoming common features of urban planning. The sophisticated diplomatic networks that had once managed intercity relations broke down as desperate rulers pursued increasingly aggressive strategies. Warfare during this period was particularly destructive because it targeted the infrastructure that sustained urban civilization. Armies deliberately destroyed water management systems, burned agricultural fields, and dismantled trade facilities. The goal wasn't just military victory, but the complete elimination of rival cities' capacity to recover. This scorched earth approach created vast, depopulated zones where previously thriving settlements had existed. The psychological impact of repeated military defeats and environmental disasters undermined the fundamental beliefs that had sustained classic civilization. Divine kingship depended on the assumption that rulers could influence supernatural forces to ensure prosperity and security. When kings consistently failed to prevent crop failures, military defeats, and social chaos, the entire ideological foundation of royal authority crumbled. Popular uprisings became increasingly common as desperate populations turned against elites who could no longer fulfill their cosmic obligations. Some archaeological evidence suggests that peasant revolts may have contributed to the final collapse of several major centers. Elite residential areas show signs of deliberate destruction that differs from typical warfare patterns, suggesting internal rather than external attackers. Luxury goods were selectively destroyed, while utilitarian items were left untouched, indicating targeted violence against symbols of elite status rather than random looting. The breakdown of specialized craft production eliminated another pillar of classic civilization. Master artisans who had spent decades perfecting techniques for working jade, obsidian, and other luxury materials found their skills irrelevant in a world focused on basic survival. The workshops that had produced the magnificent art objects we associate with classic culture were abandoned as their patrons disappeared and their products lost their cultural significance. Religious practices adapted to reflect the new reality of chronic crisis and uncertainty. Bloodletting ceremonies became more frequent and intense as desperate rulers sought to demonstrate their continued connection to divine powers. Human sacrifice, while never as common as later stereotypes suggest, appears to have increased during this period as communities sought supernatural solutions to their mounting problems. Archaeological evidence from several sites shows mass burials that may represent sacrificial offerings intended to appease angry gods. The intellectual achievements of the classic period, mathematics, astronomy, writing, largely disappeared, along with the court culture that had sustained them. Complex calendrical calculations became irrelevant when there were no royal ceremonies to schedule. Astronomical observations lost their political significance when there were no kings to legitimize through cosmic authority. The sophisticated writing system that had recorded royal histories and divine genealogies fell into disuse as the dynasties it celebrated vanished into the jungle. Yet the collapse wasn't universal or complete. In the northern regions, particularly around Chichén Itzá, new forms of civilization were emerging from the ruins of the old. These northern centers developed more flexible political systems, diversified economic strategies, and innovative approaches to environmental management that allowed them to thrive, even as the southern lowlands emptied. The collapse of classic civilization created opportunities for new cultural experiments that would define the subsequent post-classic period. The great cities of the South didn't disappear overnight. They faded gradually as successive generations abandoned hope of restoration. Some maintained small populations for centuries after their peak, with caretaker communities maintaining the most important temples and conducting simplified versions of traditional ceremonies. But the magnificent urban civilization that had dominated Mesoamerica for over 6 centuries was effectively finished by the year 900. The causes of this collapse continue to be debated by scholars, with different theories emphasizing environmental degradation, climate change, warfare, social revolution, and economic breakdown. The reality was probably a complex interaction of all these factors, creating a cascade of failures that overwhelmed the adaptive capacity of classic civilization. What began as manageable environmental and social stresses escalated into systemic collapse when multiple crisis factors reinforced each other. The legacy of the classic collapse would shape Mesoamerican civilization for centuries to come. The northern centers that survived developed new forms of political organization that were more resilient but less spectacular than their classic predecessors. The memory of the great southern cities became legendary, inspiring later generations while serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of environmental overreach and political inflexibility. In the end, the collapse of classic civilization represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how environmental limits can constrain even the most sophisticated societies. The kings who had claimed divine authority to control cosmic forces discovered that they could not overcome the basic ecological relationships that sustained human life. The jungle reclaimed their cities, but their achievements in mathematics, astronomy, art, and urban planning would influence human civilization long after their palaces crumbled into ruins. As the great southern metropolises fell silent, their monuments crumbling beneath jungle vines, a new power was emerging from the northern reaches of the peninsula. Chichén Itzá rose not as a continuation of the old order, but as something entirely revolutionary, a fusion of ancient traditions with foreign influences that would redefine Mesoamerican culture for centuries to come. The site itself had ancient roots, with ceremonial structures dating back to the 6th century. But the Chichén Itzá that would dominate the post-classic world was essentially a new creation, built by migrants who brought with them architectural styles, religious concepts, and political practices unlike anything seen before in the region. These newcomers, known as the Itzá, claimed descent from both local dynasties and distant Toltec kingdoms, creating a hybrid identity that would prove remarkably adaptable to changing circumstances. The Itzá migration stories, preserved in later chronicles, describe a people driven by prophetic visions to seek a new homeland in the north. Led by the legendary ruler Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, they traveled from the highlands of central Mexico, bringing with them revolutionary concepts about divine kingship, urban planning, and cosmic authority. Whether these migration accounts reflect historical reality or mythological justification for cultural change remains debated, but their impact on northern society was undeniable. El Castillo, the famous step pyramid that dominates the site's central plaza, represents the architectural fusion that characterized this new era. Its design incorporates elements from both traditional construction techniques and innovative Toltec influences. The structure functions as a massive solar calendar, with shadow effects marking equinoxes and solstices with mathematical precision. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, shadows cast by the pyramid's edges create the illusion of a serpent descending the northern staircase, a sophisticated demonstration of astronomical knowledge translated into architectural theatre. The Great Ball Court at Chichén Itzá dwarfs anything built during the earlier period, stretching over 500 feet in length and featuring walls that rise 30 feet above the playing field. The court's acoustics were engineered with remarkable sophistication. A whisper at one end can be heard clearly at the other, while a hand clap produces multiple echoes that mimic the call of the sacred Quetzal bird. This wasn't just an athletic venue, but a cosmic theatre where ritual games reenacted the fundamental struggle between order and chaos. The ball game itself evolved during this period into an increasingly complex ritual drama. Players, dressed as gods and mythological heroes, battled not just for victory, but for the continuation of cosmic order. The rubber ball represented the sun, and successful play ensured its continued movement through the heavens. The most important games concluded with human sacrifice, though evidence suggests that victims were often volunteers who viewed their deaths as apotheosis rather than punishment. Religious innovation reached extraordinary levels of sophistication as Chichén Itzá developed new forms of worship that combined traditional practices with foreign influences. The Temple of the Warriors showcases this synthesis, with columns carved as plumed serpents supporting a structure dedicated to both ancient rain gods and the newly prominent feathered serpent deity. Inside, murals depict complex ceremonies involving both familiar bloodletting rituals and new forms of offering that reflected Toltec religious practices. The cenotes, natural sinkholes filled with water, became focal points for increasingly elaborate sacrificial ceremonies. The sacred cenote at Chichén Itzá has yielded thousands of offerings thrown into its depths over centuries. Gold discs, jade ornaments, incense burners, and human remains. These underwater deposits reveal the international scope of the site's influence, with objects originating from as far away as Panama and Colombia. The cenote sacrifices weren't desperate attempts to appease angry gods, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that demonstrated the ruler's ability to command resources from across the known world. Maritime trade networks expanded dramatically during this period, connecting the northern peninsula with distant regions in ways that land-based routes had never achieved. Coastal settlements like Isla Cerritos became major ports handling goods from across the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Large seagoing canoes, capable of carrying tons of cargo, regularly plied routes between the peninsula and areas that are now Honduras, Belize, and even the islands of the Caribbean. The economic foundation of northern prosperity rested on control of several crucial resources. Salt production along the northern coast provided a commodity essential for food preservation and trade. The shallow lagoons and seasonal pools of the region were perfect for solar evaporation techniques that produced high-quality salt crystals coveted throughout Mesoamerica. Cotton cultivation thrived in the northern climate, supporting a textile industry that produced both utilitarian cloth and luxury garments decorated with complex patterns and brilliant dyes. Cacao remained the most prestigious trade commodity, with northern merchants controlling distribution networks that stretched from Pacific coast plantations to highland markets. The beans served not just as luxury consumables, but as standardized currency, facilitating complex commercial transactions across vast distances. Northern traders developed sophisticated credit systems and commercial partnerships that allowed them to finance expeditions and maintain warehouses in distant markets. The Puuc Hills, rising south of the northern plains, became home to a distinctive architectural tradition that rivaled Chichén Itzá in sophistication, if not in scale. Sites like Uxmal, Kaaba, and Sayil developed elaborate palaces and temples characterized by intricate stone mosaics and innovative engineering solutions. The Palace of the Governor at Uxmal demonstrates remarkable astronomical alignments, with its main facade oriented to mark the southernmost rising point of Venus during its 8-year cycle. Architectural innovation reached new heights as northern builders experimented with techniques unknown in the south. The use of concrete cores allowed for larger interior spaces and more complex structural designs. Decorative stone mosaics achieved unprecedented levels of detail, with individual elements carved to fit together like three-dimensional puzzles. The famous facades of Puuc structures feature intricate geometric patterns interspersed with representations of gods, animals, and mythological scenes that required master craftsmen to execute. Water management became increasingly sophisticated as northern communities adapted to the unique challenges of their environment. Unlike the southern regions with their rivers and lakes, the northern peninsula depended entirely on groundwater, accessed through cenotes and artificial wells. Engineers developed complex systems of underground channels that connected natural water sources with urban centers. At Uxmal, an elaborate network of chultunes, bell-shaped cisterns, captured and stored rainwater with remarkable efficiency. The political structure that emerged in the north differed significantly from the divine kingship that had characterized the southern centers. While rulers still claimed supernatural authority, power was increasingly shared among councils of nobles, merchant families, and regional governors. This more distributed system proved more resilient than the highly centralized dynasties that had dominated the south, allowing northern society to adapt more effectively to changing circumstances. Cultural synthesis reached its peak in the artistic achievements of this period. Sculptors working at Chichén Itzá created monuments that seamlessly blended iconographic traditions from multiple regions and time periods. The famous Chakmul sculptures, reclining figures holding offering bowls on their stomachs, represent a completely new artistic form that would influence Mesoamerican art for centuries. These figures served as intermediaries between human worshippers and divine recipients, their positioning carefully calculated to facilitate the transfer of offerings from earthly to supernatural realms. The intellectual traditions that had flourished in the south found new expression in northern contexts. Astronomical observation continued with remarkable precision, but the focus shifted from legitimizing individual rulers to maintaining cosmic harmony for entire communities. Calendar keeping became a community responsibility rather than a royal prerogative, with multiple specialists working together to ensure accurate timekeeping and proper scheduling of ceremonies. Regional variations within the Northern Renaissance reflected the diverse cultural influences that shaped this period. Coastal settlements developed distinctive maritime traditions, while inland communities focused on agricultural innovations. Highland areas maintained stronger connections to southern traditions, while lowland sites embraced more radical experiments in cultural fusion. This diversity created a rich cultural landscape where different communities could specialize in particular activities while remaining connected through trade and shared religious practices. The rise of Chichén Itzá represented more than just political succession. It marked the emergence of a new model for Mesoamerican society. The integration of diverse cultural traditions, the emphasis on maritime commerce, and the development of more flexible political structures would influence the region's development for centuries to come. This Northern Renaissance demonstrated that cultural innovation could emerge from apparent decline, transforming crisis into opportunity through creative adaptation and synthetic thinking. Yet even as Chichén Itzá reached the height of its power and influence during the 11th century, internal tensions were building that would eventually challenge its dominance. The very cultural diversity that had been a source of strength was also creating factional conflicts as different groups competed for influence. The extensive trade networks that brought prosperity also created dependencies that could be disrupted by external forces. The political experiments that had initially proven so successful were beginning to generate new forms of instability that would ultimately lead to another transformation in the region's cultural landscape. The mysterious abandonment of Chichén Itzá around 1200 created a power vacuum that would reshape the political landscape of Mesoamerica once again. As the great northern capital fell silent, its magnificent structures slowly surrendering to jungle growth, new centers emerged to claim the mantle of regional leadership. The age that followed would be characterized not by the concentrated power of single great metropolises, but by the rise of confederated systems that distributed authority among multiple competing centers. Mayapan emerged as the most successful claimant to regional dominance, establishing itself as the capital of what scholars term the League of Mayapan. This new political entity represented a fundamental departure from earlier forms of governance, organizing dozens of previously independent settlements into a loose confederation, bound together by tribute obligations, trade agreements, and shared religious practices. The system proved remarkably durable, maintaining stability across the northern peninsula for over 2 centuries. The capital itself reflected these new political realities. Unlike the monumental architecture of earlier periods, Mayapan's buildings were smaller in scale but more numerous, housing representatives from subordinate communities who maintained permanent residences in the Confederate capital. The site functioned as both administrative center and diplomatic forum, where delegates from member settlements gathered to negotiate disputes, coordinate military campaigns, and organize large-scale ceremonies that reinforced their collective identity. Political authority within this confederation was shared among multiple institutions, rather than concentrated in divine kingship. The Kokom family provided hereditary leadership, but their power was balanced by councils representing merchant guilds, military orders, and regional governors. This system of checks and balances prevented any single faction from accumulating excessive authority while ensuring that different interest groups had meaningful representation in Confederate decision-making. The highland regions developed their own distinctive political traditions during this period, with powerful centers like Kumarkaj and Zacualo dominating the mountainous territories of what is now Guatemala. These highland kingdoms maintained closer connections to central Mexican traditions than their lowland counterparts, adopting military technologies and political practices derived from Toltec and later Aztec influences. The result was a more militarized society, where warrior elites played prominent roles in governance and religious ceremonies. Highland architecture reflected these cultural orientations, with fortress-like complexes built on defensible hilltops, rather than the open plazas characteristic of lowland sites. The emphasis on military preparedness was evident in massive defensive walls, strategically positioned watchtowers, and residential areas designed to withstand siege conditions. These weren't just practical military installations. They were statements of power that proclaimed their builders' readiness to defend their territories against any challenger. The economic systems that sustained post-classic society were more diverse and resilient than those of earlier periods. Rather than depending primarily on agricultural surpluses and elite luxury consumption, communities developed specialized production systems that served both local needs and long-distance trade. Coastal settlements focused on salt production and marine resources. Highland communities specialized in obsidian working and textile production, while lowland areas concentrated on cacao cultivation and forest products. Market systems became increasingly sophisticated as standardized currencies and commercial regulations facilitated complex transactions across vast distances. Cacao beans remained the primary medium of exchange, but their use was supplemented by cotton textiles, copper bells, and jade ornaments that served specific functions in different types of commercial relationships. Professional merchant classes emerged with their own guilds, trade routes, and diplomatic privileges that allowed them to operate across political boundaries. Cultural practices evolved to accommodate the new political realities while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. Religious ceremonies became more community-oriented and less focused on individual rulers, though they retained their essential function of maintaining cosmic harmony and social solidarity. The famous feathered serpent deity continued to play a central role in ceremonial life, but worship was organized by priestly colleges rather than royal courts. Ritual practices intensified in some areas as communities sought to maintain divine favor during periods of political uncertainty. Human sacrifice, while never as common as later Spanish accounts suggested, appears to have increased in frequency and elaboration during certain periods. Archaeological evidence from sites like Mayapan shows specialized sacrificial platforms where captives taken in warfare were offered to ensure military success and agricultural productivity. Bloodletting ceremonies remained central to religious practice, but they were increasingly democratized beyond royal participation. Elite families throughout Confederate territories maintained the right to perform these rituals, and evidence suggests that even non-noble community leaders occasionally participated in simplified versions of traditional ceremonies. This broader participation helped maintain cultural continuity while adapting ancient practices to new social structures. The ball game continued to serve crucial social and religious functions, though its organization reflected the changing political landscape. Rather than single courts serving royal ceremonies, communities built multiple smaller courts that hosted regular competitions between different neighborhoods, occupational groups, and visiting teams. These games served as both entertainment and diplomacy, providing venues for negotiating disputes and building alliances between different communities. Highland and lowland societies developed increasingly distinct cultural characteristics during this period. Lowland communities maintained stronger connections to maritime traditions and maintained more egalitarian social structures, while highland settlements embraced more hierarchical military organizations and adopted central Mexican religious practices. These regional variations created a cultural mosaic where different areas specialized in particular traditions while remaining connected through trade and shared ancestral heritage. Women's roles in post-classic society appear to have expanded beyond their traditional functions in earlier periods. Archaeological evidence suggests that female merchants played important roles in long-distance trade, while noble women continued to wield significant political influence through marriage alliances and inheritance rights. Some communities may have recognized female rulers, though the evidence remains fragmentary and difficult to interpret definitively. Intellectual traditions adapted to serve the needs of more distributed political systems. Calendar keeping and astronomical observation continued with remarkable precision, but the knowledge was maintained by professional specialists who served entire confederations rather than individual rulers. Scribal schools trained bureaucrats capable of managing the complex administrative requirements of multi-community political entities. The writing system simplified somewhat during this period, with less emphasis on the elaborate historical narratives that had characterized royal monuments and more focus on practical record-keeping for administrative and commercial purposes. Books written on bark paper became more common as literacy spread beyond royal courts to merchant families and professional administrators who needed written records for their activities. Technological innovation continued despite the political upheavals of the period. Highland communities developed new techniques for working copper and bronze, creating tools and ornaments that represented significant advances over earlier technologies. Lowland settlements experimented with improved agricultural techniques, including raised field systems that could produce higher yields with less environmental impact than previous methods. The military technologies and tactics that had emerged during the late phase of southern conflicts were refined and systematized during the post-classic period. Professional warrior classes developed standardized equipment and training methods that made Confederate armies more effective than the informal levies that had characterized earlier periods. The introduction of bow and arrow technology from central Mexico provided new tactical options that changed the nature of regional conflicts. Regional trade networks reached unprecedented levels of sophistication as specialized merchants developed commercial relationships spanning from central Mexico to lower Central America. Highland obsidian reached Caribbean coastal settlements, while lowland cacao and cotton were distributed throughout mountainous regions. These commercial connections helped maintain cultural unity despite political fragmentation. Religious pilgrimage became an important institution that connected diverse communities through shared spiritual practices. Sacred sites like the cenotes of the Northern Peninsula attracted visitors from throughout the region, creating opportunities for cultural exchange and diplomatic contact that supplemented formal political relationships. These pilgrimage networks helped maintain a sense of shared identity, despite the absence of unified political authority. The approach of the 16th century brought increasing contact with European influences, though initially through indirect channels. Spanish expeditions along the Caribbean coast introduced new diseases and technologies that began affecting indigenous communities long before direct conquest attempts. The political flexibility that had characterized post-classic society would prove both advantageous and problematic in dealing with these unprecedented challenges. As the year 1511 approached, a shipwrecked Spanish expedition would place the first Europeans directly into contact with indigenous American societies. The survivors of this maritime disaster would become involuntary participants in a cultural encounter that would fundamentally transform the region's development. The political systems, economic networks, and cultural practices that had evolved during the post-classic period would soon face their greatest test as two vastly different worlds collided in ways that neither side could have anticipated. The encounter began not with conquest, but with survival. In 1511, a Spanish ship sailing from Panama to Santo Domingo foundered on the treacherous reefs off the eastern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. Of the 20 survivors who reached shore, most would die within months from disease, starvation, or sacrifice. But 2 men, Gonzalo Guerrero and Jerónimo de Aguilar, would live among indigenous communities for 8 years, becoming the first Europeans to experience American society from within. Their stories illuminate the complexity of cultural contact that would characterize the next century. Aguilar maintained his Christian faith and Spanish identity, while learning local languages and customs, positioning himself as a potential intermediary between worlds. Guerrero chose a different path, marrying into a noble family, adopting indigenous dress and customs, and eventually leading military resistance against Spanish expeditions. Their divergent choices prefigured the range of responses that would emerge as European and American societies encountered each other. When Hernán Cortés landed on the Yucatan coast in 1519, he was searching not for conquest, but for provisions and information on his route to the fabled riches of central Mexico. The expedition's brief encounters with coastal communities provided the Spanish with their first systematic intelligence about American political systems, religious practices, and material culture. These initial contacts were characterized more by mutual curiosity than hostility, with both sides seeking to understand the strange foreigners they had encountered. The impact of European diseases preceded actual conquest by years, creating demographic catastrophes that fundamentally altered the balance of power between indigenous communities. Smallpox, measles, and typhus swept through populations that had no immunity to these old-world pathogens. Mortality rates reached 90% in some areas, devastating communities and disrupting the political systems that had maintained stability for centuries. The scale of this biological disaster cannot be overstated. It was the greatest demographic collapse in human history. Francisco de Montejo, the Elder, received a royal grant to conquer the Yucatan in 1526, beginning a campaign that would last over 2 decades and ultimately require 3 separate expeditions to achieve even partial success. His initial attempts failed spectacularly, with Spanish forces repeatedly defeated by indigenous armies that had adapted European military technologies, while maintaining their own tactical advantages. The dense jungle terrain, guerrilla tactics, and hostile climate proved far more challenging than the open battlefields where Spanish cavalry and gunpowder had triumphed in central Mexico. The First Montejo expedition, 1527 to 1528, established temporary bases along the eastern coast, but could not penetrate inland against determined resistance. Indigenous forces had quickly learned to counter Spanish advantages, avoiding direct confrontations while conducting constant harassment that prevented the establishment of permanent settlements. The expedition collapsed when supply lines from Cuba were disrupted, and Spanish forces found themselves isolated in hostile territory. Montejo's second attempt, 1531 to 1535, approached from the western coast, establishing the settlement of Campeche as a base for inland operations. This campaign achieved greater initial success, with Spanish forces reaching the interior and establishing alliances with some indigenous groups who viewed the Europeans as potential allies against their traditional enemies. However, coordinated uprisings eventually forced the Spanish to abandon most of their conquests and retreat to coastal strongholds. The final campaign, 1540 to 1546, succeeded only because demographic collapse had fundamentally altered the military balance. Diseases had reduced indigenous populations to levels that could no longer sustain effective resistance, while Spanish reinforcements and indigenous allies provided the resources necessary for systematic conquest. The establishment of Mérida in 1542 marked the beginning of permanent European control over the northern peninsula, though large areas remained beyond effective Spanish authority. Indigenous responses to conquest varied dramatically across different regions and communities. Some groups, particularly those who had been subordinate to larger powers, initially welcomed Spanish intervention as an opportunity to overturn existing hierarchies. Others, especially the highland kingdoms of Guatemala, mounted fierce resistance that required decades to overcome. The most successful indigenous strategies combined diplomatic flexibility with military resilience, allowing communities to negotiate favorable terms while maintaining cultural autonomy. The highlands of Guatemala presented Spanish forces with different challenges than those encountered in the Yucatan. The Quichés kingdom of Cumarcaj commanded a confederation of allied settlements that could field large armies equipped with sophisticated weapons and defensive fortifications. Pedro de Alvarado's conquest of this region, 1524 to 1540, required systematic campaigns against multiple strongholds, each defended by communities fighting for their political and cultural survival. The Siege of Cumarcaj in 1524 demonstrated both the military effectiveness and cultural brutality of Spanish conquest methods. After capturing the capital through treachery, Spanish forces burned the city and executed its rulers, sending a message that resistance would be met with total destruction. However, the fall of the capital did not end highland resistance, which continued through guerrilla campaigns that lasted for decades. Far to the south, in the lakes and forests of the Petén region, the Itzá kingdom of Tayasal maintained complete independence for nearly 2 centuries after the initial Spanish invasion. Protected by difficult terrain and unified political leadership, this community successfully resisted all conquest attempts until 1697, when Spanish forces finally captured the island capital after a siege that lasted several months. The fall of Tayasal marked the end of the last independent indigenous kingdom in the Americas. The strategies employed by the Itzá to maintain independence provide insight into the factors that determined success or failure in resisting European conquest. Geographic isolation protected them from the diseases that devastated other communities, while political unity prevented the factional conflicts that Spanish forces had exploited elsewhere. Most importantly, they maintained control over trade routes that provided access to European goods without requiring submission to Spanish authority. Religious conversion became the primary justification for Spanish rule after initial conquest. But the process proved far more complex than European missionaries anticipated. Indigenous communities developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining traditional practices while appearing to accept Christianity. Syncretistic religious systems emerged that combined European and American elements in ways that satisfied Spanish requirements while preserving essential cultural functions. Diego de Landa's tenure as Bishop of Yucatan, 1549 to 1579, epitomized both the missionary zeal and cultural destruction that characterized Spanish colonial policy. His infamous auto de fe in 1562 burned thousands of indigenous books, art objects, and religious artifacts in an attempt to eradicate what he viewed as demonic practices. The scale of this cultural destruction was unprecedented. Entire libraries of accumulated knowledge disappeared in a few hours of religious fanaticism. Yet Landa's own writings, particularly his Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, provide some of our most detailed information about pre-conquest society. His attempts to understand indigenous calendar systems, religious practices, and historical traditions preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. This paradox, destructive persecution coupled with scholarly documentation, characterized much of the Spanish colonial experience. Indigenous communities developed remarkable strategies for cultural preservation, despite intensive efforts at forced conversion. Sacred books were hidden in caves and remote locations, while traditional ceremonies continued in secret or were disguised as Christian festivals. The famous Books of Chilambalam, written during the colonial period, demonstrate how communities maintained historical consciousness and prophetic traditions while adapting to European literary forms. Economic exploitation accompanied religious conversion as Spanish colonial authorities sought to extract wealth from their new territories. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities, requiring tribute payments and labor services in exchange for theoretical protection and religious instruction. In practice, this system often amounted to legalized slavery that devastated communities already weakened by disease and warfare. The demographic consequences of conquest extended far beyond initial military campaigns. Disease, forced labor, and cultural disruption created a downward spiral that reduced indigenous populations to perhaps 10% of their pre-conquest levels. Entire regions were depopulated, while survivors were concentrated in Spanish-controlled settlements, where they could be more easily monitored and exploited. Regional variations in conquest experiences reflected differences in indigenous political systems, geographic conditions, and Spanish colonial strategies. Coastal areas under direct Spanish control experienced more intensive cultural pressure than remote highland communities that maintained greater autonomy. Communities with strong traditional leadership often preserved more of their cultural practices than those where conquest had disrupted established authority structures. Women's experiences during conquest were particularly complex, as they faced both the general trauma of cultural destruction and specific vulnerabilities related to their gender. Some indigenous women married Spanish men, creating mestizo families that bridged cultural boundaries, while often experiencing discrimination from both communities. Others maintained traditional roles within indigenous communities, while adapting to new economic and religious requirements imposed by colonial authority. The Spanish colonial system that emerged from conquest represented an uneasy synthesis of European and American elements. Indigenous communities were incorporated into colonial society as subordinate populations, but they retained enough autonomy to maintain essential cultural practices. The result was a complex social hierarchy that recognized ethnic differences while creating new categories of mixed ancestry that would shape regional identity for centuries. Resistance to Spanish rule took many forms beyond direct military confrontation. Communities developed legal strategies for protecting their lands and privileges, using Spanish courts to defend traditional rights. Economic resistance included work slowdowns, tribute evasion, and maintenance of traditional trade networks that operated outside colonial control. Cultural resistance preserved languages, ceremonies, and historical traditions despite intensive efforts at forced assimilation. The legacy of conquest would influence the region's development for centuries to come. The demographic collapse created vast empty spaces that were slowly repopulated through migration and natural increase. The destruction of indigenous political systems eliminated traditional mechanisms for conflict resolution and resource management. Most importantly, the cultural trauma of conquest created lasting tensions between indigenous and European-derived populations that continue to influence contemporary social relationships. As the 16th century drew to a close, the basic patterns of colonial society had been established. Spanish political control was secure in most areas, though remote communities maintained significant autonomy. The Catholic Church had established institutional dominance while accommodating syncretic practices that preserved indigenous elements. Economic systems extracted wealth for Spanish benefit while providing subsistence for indigenous communities. The foundation had been laid for a colonial society that would persist for 3 centuries, shaped by the violent encounter between two worlds that neither side had anticipated. The century following conquest witnessed one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural persistence under extreme duress. Despite systematic efforts to eradicate their traditions, indigenous communities developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining their identity while adapting to colonial demands. The result was neither complete assimilation nor total resistance, but a complex process of cultural negotiation that would define the region's character for centuries to come. Colonial society emerged as a rigidly hierarchical system that placed Europeans at the top, indigenous peoples at the bottom, and various categories of mixed ancestry in between. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities, theoretically in exchange for protection and religious instruction. In practice, this arrangement often amounted to legalized exploitation that extracted labor and tribute while providing minimal benefits to indigenous populations. The Catholic Church became the primary institution responsible for cultural transformation, establishing missions, schools, and parishes throughout the conquered territories. Franciscan missionaries, who dominated the early colonial period, pursued an ambitious program of cultural replacement that sought to eliminate indigenous religious practices while implanting European Christian traditions. Their efforts met with mixed success, creating syncretic religious systems that combined elements from both traditions in unexpected ways. Indigenous communities responded to religious pressure with remarkable creativity, developing practices that satisfied colonial requirements while preserving essential cultural functions. Sacred sites were often transformed into Christian shrines, allowing traditional pilgrimage patterns to continue under new justifications. Ancient deities were identified with Catholic saints, permitting the continuation of specific devotional practices within acceptable frameworks. calendar ceremonies persisted by being integrated into the Christian liturgical year. The destruction of indigenous books and monuments during the early colonial period represented one of history's greatest cultural catastrophes. Diego de Landa's infamous auto de fe in 1562 destroyed an estimated 5,000 idols and 27 codices, eliminating centuries of accumulated knowledge in a few hours of religious zealotry. Yet this systematic destruction also motivated preservation efforts that might not otherwise have occurred. Hidden libraries emerged throughout the colonial period as communities secretly maintained traditional books while creating new texts that recorded ancient knowledge in modified forms. The famous Books of Chilambalam, written in indigenous languages using European alphabetic script, preserved historical chronicles, prophetic traditions, and astronomical knowledge that would otherwise have disappeared. These clandestine texts demonstrate the sophisticated strategies communities developed for cultural preservation. Language preservation became a crucial battleground in the struggle for cultural survival. Spanish colonial policy vacillated between promoting indigenous languages as vehicles for Christian instruction and suppressing them as obstacles to cultural assimilation. Communities responded by maintaining multilingual competence, with individuals capable of operating in Spanish colonial contexts, while preserving native linguistic traditions for internal use. The development of indigenous literacy in alphabetic script created new possibilities for cultural preservation and resistance. Traditional knowledge that had previously been transmitted orally or through pictographic writing could now be recorded in forms that were less vulnerable to destruction. Legal documents, correspondence, and historical accounts written by indigenous authors provide invaluable insights into colonial period experiences from non-European perspectives. Economic exploitation under colonial rule created tremendous hardships, while also generating adaptive strategies that ensured community survival. The tribute system required regular payments in goods or labor, forcing communities to participate in colonial economic networks while maintaining subsistence production for their own needs. Many groups developed specialized craft production that could satisfy tribute obligations while providing income for community projects. Agricultural systems adapted to colonial demands while maintaining traditional practices essential for food security. Spanish authorities promoted European crops and livestock, but indigenous communities continued cultivating traditional varieties that were better adapted to local conditions. The result was diversified agricultural systems that combined old and new techniques to maximize both productivity and resilience. Regional variations in colonial experience reflected differences in Spanish administrative priorities, indigenous political traditions, and geographic conditions. Communities in remote areas often maintained greater autonomy than those near Spanish settlements, while groups with strong traditional leadership proved more successful at negotiating favorable arrangements with colonial authorities. Coastal regions experienced more intensive cultural pressure than highland areas that remained largely indigenous in character. Women's roles evolved in complex ways during the colonial period, as traditional gender systems adapted to new economic and social pressures. Indigenous women often served as cultural mediators, maintaining household traditions while interacting with colonial institutions. Some achieved significant economic independence through craft production or market activities, while others found new opportunities within colonial religious institutions. The legal system provided unexpected opportunities for indigenous resistance and cultural preservation. Spanish law recognized indigenous communities as corporate entities with certain rights and privileges, creating mechanisms for defending traditional territories and practices through colonial courts. Skilled indigenous lawyers emerged who could navigate European legal systems while advocating for community interests. Land tenure became a central issue in colonial relationships, as Spanish authorities sought to consolidate indigenous populations into concentrated settlements while appropriating traditional territories for European use. Communities developed sophisticated legal strategies for defending their lands, producing detailed maps and historical documentation that demonstrated long-standing occupation rights. These efforts met with mixed success, but established important precedents for later resistance movements. Marriage patterns reflected the complex social dynamics of colonial society, with intermarriage creating new ethnic categories, while also generating tensions between different communities. Children of mixed ancestry often faced discrimination from both indigenous and European populations, leading to the development of distinct mestizo cultural traditions that combined elements from multiple sources. Educational policies revealed the contradictions inherent in colonial cultural projects. Spanish authorities established schools to promote European culture and Christian doctrine, but education also provided indigenous communities with tools for defending their interests within colonial systems. Literacy in Spanish opened new opportunities for legal advocacy, economic advancement, and political participation, while also facilitating cultural preservation efforts. Demographic recovery began slowly during the 17th century, as indigenous populations developed immunity to European diseases and adapted to colonial conditions. Population growth varied significantly across different regions, with some areas remaining largely depopulated, while others experienced substantial recovery. This demographic renaissance provided the foundation for cultural revival movements that would gain momentum in subsequent centuries. The 18th century brought new pressures as Bourbon administrative reforms sought to increase colonial efficiency and revenue extraction. These policies often disrupted traditional arrangements that had allowed indigenous communities to maintain relative autonomy within the colonial system. Increased taxation, labor demands, and cultural pressure generated new forms of resistance that sometimes erupted into open rebellion. The Caste War of Yucatan, 1847 to 1901, represented the culmination of centuries of accumulated grievances and the largest indigenous uprising in the Americas since conquest. Beginning as a conflict over land rights and political representation, the war evolved into a comprehensive attempt to restore indigenous political autonomy and cultural traditions. The rebels established independent territories that maintained traditional practices while adapting modern military technologies. The war's complex dynamics reflected the sophisticated political consciousness that had developed within indigenous communities during the colonial period. Rebel leaders combined traditional authority with modern organizational techniques, creating military and administrative systems that could coordinate resistance across vast territories. Their success in maintaining independence for over half a century demonstrated the persistence of indigenous political traditions, despite centuries of colonial suppression. Archaeological rediscovery during the 19th century brought new attention to pre-conquest achievements, while also creating opportunities for cultural revival. The expeditions of John Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood, 1839 to 1842, produced detailed documentation of ancient sites that had been largely forgotten by European colonists. Their publications sparked international interest in indigenous history while providing contemporary communities with new evidence of their ancestors' accomplishments. The emergence of archaeological tourism created economic opportunities for indigenous communities while also raising new questions about cultural ownership and representation. Sites like Chichén Itzá and Uxmal became international destinations that generated revenue for both government agencies and local populations. However, tourism also brought external pressures that sometimes conflicted with traditional land use patterns and cultural practices. Educational movements during the late 19th and early 20th centuries began incorporating indigenous history and culture into formal curricula, reversing centuries of systematic exclusion. These efforts often originated within indigenous communities themselves, as literate leaders sought to document and transmit traditional knowledge to younger generations who were increasingly exposed to external cultural influences. The Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, created new opportunities for indigenous political participation, while also generating upheavals that disrupted traditional community structures. Revolutionary leaders like Emiliano Zapata championed indigenous land rights, while constitutional reforms recognized the collective rights of indigenous communities. However, the implementation of these reforms proved inconsistent, creating ongoing tensions between official policies and local realities. Linguistic preservation efforts intensified during the 20th century, as communities recognized the threat posed by increasing Spanish dominance in education and public life. Informal schools emerged that taught traditional languages alongside Spanish, while cultural organizations worked to document indigenous linguistic traditions through writing systems and audio recordings. The persistence of traditional religious practices throughout the colonial and post-colonial periods demonstrates the remarkable resilience of indigenous cultural systems. Despite centuries of Christian evangelization, many communities maintained ceremonial traditions that preserved ancient relationships with natural and supernatural forces. These practices often incorporated Christian elements while retaining essential indigenous characteristics. Modern anthropological studies have revealed the extraordinary sophistication of surviving indigenous knowledge systems, particularly in areas like traditional medicine, agricultural techniques, and environmental management. This accumulated wisdom represents centuries of experimentation and adaptation that has produced sustainable practices uniquely suited to local conditions. Recognition of this knowledge has grown in recent decades as global society seeks alternatives to environmentally destructive development models. The survival of indigenous communities through centuries of systematic oppression stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural persistence. Their strategies for maintaining identity while adapting to changing circumstances provide valuable insights into the dynamics of cultural change and resistance. Most importantly, their continued presence ensures that the remarkable achievements of pre-conquest societies remain part of contemporary cultural landscapes, rather than merely archaeological curiosities. 6 million people across Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, and Honduras wake each morning speaking languages that echo through millennia of continuous cultural transmission. They are the living descendants of the pyramid builders, the heirs to astronomical knowledge that tracked celestial cycles with mathematical precision, the keepers of agricultural traditions that sustained vast urban populations in tropical environments. Their existence represents one of humanity's greatest stories of cultural survival against overwhelming odds. Contemporary communities have transformed the survival strategies developed during centuries of colonial oppression into foundations for cultural renaissance. The same linguistic diversity that Spanish authorities once sought to eliminate now serves as a source of ethnic pride and political mobilization. Over 30 distinct languages continue to be spoken, each representing unique perspectives on human relationships with natural and supernatural worlds that evolved over thousands of years. Guatemala contains the largest indigenous population in the Americas, with communities maintaining traditional practices while engaging modern political and economic systems. The highlands remain predominantly indigenous in character, with market towns serving as cultural centers, where ancient weaving traditions produce textiles that combine pre-conquest designs with contemporary innovations. These markets represent more than commercial exchanges. They are cultural institutions where traditional knowledge is transmitted across generations. Educational movements have achieved remarkable success in promoting indigenous language literacy, while ensuring that young people acquire the Spanish or English skills necessary for participation in national economic systems. Bilingual schools now operate throughout the region, teaching traditional knowledge alongside modern curricula. These educational innovations represent sophisticated responses to globalization pressures that seek to maintain cultural distinctiveness while enabling economic advancement. The resurgence of indigenous political participation has transformed national politics throughout the region. In Guatemala, indigenous candidates have achieved significant electoral success at local and national levels, while in Mexico, constitutional reforms have recognized the collective rights of indigenous communities. These political gains reflect decades of organizing efforts that combine traditional leadership structures with modern advocacy techniques. Women have played particularly important roles in contemporary cultural revival movements, often serving as the primary transmitters of traditional languages, religious practices, and craft techniques. Indigenous women's organizations have achieved significant success in promoting both gender equality and cultural preservation, demonstrating that these goals can be mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory. Traditional medical systems continue to serve large populations while increasingly gaining recognition from mainstream healthcare institutions. Indigenous healers maintain sophisticated knowledge of medicinal plants and therapeutic techniques that complement rather than compete with modern medicine. Research collaborations between traditional healers and university scientists have produced important innovations in drug development and treatment approaches. Agricultural practices developed over millennia provide sustainable alternatives to industrial farming methods that have proven environmentally destructive. Traditional polyculture systems that integrate multiple crops in complex rotations maintain soil fertility while producing diverse harvests that ensure food security. These techniques attract increasing attention from environmental scientists seeking solutions to climate change and biodiversity loss. Religious traditions demonstrate remarkable continuity despite centuries of Christian evangelization. Contemporary ceremonies often incorporate Catholic elements while maintaining essential indigenous characteristics, creating syncretic practices that serve both traditional spiritual needs and community social functions. Sacred sites continue to attract pilgrims from throughout the region, maintaining cultural connections that transcend national boundaries. The famous 2012 phenomenon provided an unexpected opportunity for cultural education as global media attention focused on indigenous calendar systems and cosmological traditions. Rather than predicting world destruction, traditional knowledge holders emphasized that 2012 marked the completion of a major calendrical cycle and the beginning of a new era of human consciousness. This global attention created platforms for indigenous voices that had previously been marginalized in international discussions. Archaeological tourism has generated both opportunities and challenges for contemporary communities. Sites like Chichén Itzá, Tikal, and Palenque attract millions of visitors annually, providing employment and economic development in predominantly indigenous regions. However, tourism also creates pressures for cultural commercialization that can distort traditional practices for external consumption. Many communities have developed sophisticated approaches to tourism that maintain cultural authenticity while generating economic benefits. Community-based tourism initiatives allow visitors to experience contemporary indigenous life, while ensuring that revenues support local development priorities. These programs often include educational components that teach visitors about ongoing cultural traditions, rather than focusing exclusively on archaeological remains. Language revitalization efforts have achieved remarkable success, despite ongoing pressures toward linguistic assimilation. Digital technologies provide new tools for documenting and transmitting traditional languages, while social media platforms enable speakers from different communities to maintain contact and coordinate preservation efforts. Younger generations increasingly view multilingual competence as an advantage rather than a burden. Contemporary art movements combine traditional techniques with modern themes and materials, creating innovative expressions that communicate indigenous perspectives to both local and international audiences. Painters, sculptors, writers, and musicians draw inspiration from ancestral traditions while addressing contemporary social and political issues. These artistic innovations demonstrate the dynamic character of living cultures that continue evolving while maintaining essential characteristics. Political activism has achieved significant legal victories that protect indigenous rights while establishing precedents for other minority populations worldwide. Constitutional reforms in several countries now recognize indigenous languages as official, protect collective land rights, and guarantee cultural autonomy in education and local governance. These legal achievements required decades of organizing efforts that combine traditional consensus building with modern advocacy techniques. Environmental protection movements increasingly recognize indigenous communities as crucial allies in conservation efforts. Traditional ecological knowledge provides insights into sustainable resource management that complement scientific approaches to environmental protection. Indigenous territories often contain the region's most biodiverse ecosystems, making community-based conservation essential for maintaining ecological integrity. International recognition of indigenous rights has created new opportunities for cultural preservation and political advocacy. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provides legal frameworks that communities can use to defend their territories and cultural practices. This international attention also generates resources for development projects that prioritize community needs over external economic interests. Contemporary challenges include ongoing discrimination, economic marginalization, and environmental threats that disproportionately affect indigenous communities. Climate change impacts traditional agricultural systems, while development projects often threaten sacred sites and natural resources essential for cultural practices. Addressing these challenges requires sustained political mobilization and creative adaptation strategies. Economic development initiatives increasingly emphasize approaches that build on traditional strengths rather than replacing them with external models. Craft cooperatives, eco-tourism projects, and sustainable agriculture programs generate income while maintaining cultural practices that might otherwise disappear under economic pressure. These initiatives demonstrate that cultural preservation and economic development can be mutually supporting rather than conflicting goals. Educational achievements have been particularly impressive, with increasing numbers of Indigenous students completing university studies while maintaining strong connections to their cultural communities. Indigenous professionals now work in fields ranging from medicine and law to engineering and computer science, often bringing traditional perspectives to modern professional challenges. The persistence of traditional calendar keeping demonstrates the continued relevance of ancient knowledge systems in contemporary contexts. Community leaders still consult traditional calendars when scheduling important ceremonies and agricultural activities, maintaining timing systems that have proven their effectiveness over millennia. These practices reflect sophisticated understanding of natural cycles that remains valuable in an era of environmental uncertainty. Cultural festivals and ceremonies continue to serve essential social functions while adapting to contemporary circumstances. Traditional celebrations now often incorporate modern elements like sound systems and video documentation, while maintaining their core spiritual and social purposes. These adaptations demonstrate the dynamic character of living traditions that evolve while preserving essential characteristics. Research collaborations between indigenous communities and academic institutions have produced important innovations in fields ranging from astronomy and mathematics to agriculture and environmental science. These partnerships often reveal that traditional knowledge systems contain sophisticated insights that complement modern scientific approaches. Such collaborations also ensure that research benefits the communities that contribute their knowledge. The global indigenous rights movement has provided platforms for sharing strategies and building solidarity across cultural boundaries. Indigenous leaders from different continents learn from each other's experiences while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that make their individual cultures unique. This international networking strengthens local movements while contributing to global efforts for social justice and environmental protection. Digital technologies create new possibilities for cultural preservation and transmission that were unimaginable just decades ago. Online archives now contain thousands of hours of traditional music, stories, and ceremonial recordings that ensure cultural knowledge will be available for future generations. Social media platforms enable young people to maintain cultural connections, even when they live far from their ancestral communities. The 21st century has witnessed unprecedented levels of indigenous cultural revival and political mobilization throughout the Americas. Communities that were once expected to disappear through assimilation have instead achieved new levels of political recognition and cultural vitality. This renaissance demonstrates that globalization need not result in cultural homogenization if communities possess the resources and determination to maintain their distinctive traditions. Looking toward the future, indigenous communities face both opportunities and challenges that will shape their development for generations to come. Climate change threatens traditional livelihoods, while also creating opportunities for communities with sophisticated environmental knowledge to contribute to global sustainability efforts. Educational achievements enable greater political participation, while also creating pressures for cultural adaptation that must be carefully managed. The story that began with the first cultivation of maize in highland valleys continues today in the voices of children learning traditional languages, the hands of weavers creating textiles that carry ancient designs into contemporary contexts, and the ceremonies that maintain relationships with natural and supernatural forces that have sustained human communities for millennia. Time remains unbroken, flowing from past through present toward futures that will be shaped by the same creative adaptability that has enabled survival through previous challenges. The remarkable persistence of indigenous cultures throughout centuries of systematic oppression provides hope for cultural diversity in an increasingly globalized world. Their achievements demonstrate that human societies can maintain distinctive characteristics while engaging broader political and economic systems. Most importantly, Their continued presence ensures that the remarkable intellectual and artistic achievements of pre-conquest societies remain living traditions rather than museum exhibits, contributing to contemporary human knowledge while pointing toward possible futures that honor both tradition and innovation. The calendar turns, the ceremonies continue, and the story flows onward, unbroken through time.